All right, I've been doing a ton of FSR3 testing, but on GPUs that are actually supported or even recommended by AMD for them to work. NVIDIA's RTX 4000 series, recommended. AMD's 7000 series and 6000 series, recommended. But even NVIDIA's 20 series is listed as supported. I haven't tested any myself yet, but their 10 series of GPUs is lit like this 1060 we've got here. This is going to be listed as supported for the upscaling, but not for the new frame generation, which is the main new feature. Now, AMD says that their frame generation, the interpolation and optical flow analysis, happens using asynchronous compute, and the 10 series of GPUs is not known for good asynchronous compute. So I'm very curious if we'll get any frame generation benefit at all, because even though it says it's not supported, that doesn't mean you can't click the button. So what we're gonna find out today is on a 1060 and a 1070, if we just click the frame generation button, what happens? Now, right now we have to test in Immortals of Avium. There's also Forspoken, but I find it's working better in Immortals of Avium. And this game is very demanding. It's Unreal Engine 5, it's very hard to run, and low base frame rates will make this extra challenging, but that's what we've got to work with today. Let's go ahead and just plug it in and see what happens. All right, Immortals of Avium is an Unreal Engine 5 game, and it does not offer a lot of scalability in its graphics settings. I have already turned everything to the left. We're on lows. I think I left, filtering at like 8x instead of 16. That shouldn't be that big of a deal. But the point is, we've got everything turned down. And despite that, the GTX 1060 is struggling. We're at a native 1080p resolution and no upscaling on at this point. So we are at 25-ish frames per second staring this way, and looking out over the city, we've got can drop a little bit lower into the lower 20s, a lot more geometry there happening out into the distance. This is a difficult scene to run. And again, screen capture cannot, you're at 60 frames per second locked, but it's not synced up to what we're seeing here. The point is, as I turn the camera, it is very you can see the gaps between frames, if that makes sense. We could use a higher frame rate. It's also not very responsive. It feels very delayed on the mouse movement. You wouldn't really want to play the game this way. NVIDIA's performance overlay is telling me we've got about 170-ish milliseconds, 160 something. It bounces around, sometimes up as high as almost 180 or 200. Milliseconds of PC latency, and that's not even taking into account the your mouse and peripherals themselves. Anyway, if we kick on FSR3, right, we can't use DLSS on a GTX card, but FSR3 has upscaling, and the upscaling mode is supported on the 10 series, but we can click the frame generation button. We'll certainly play around with that. But first of all, actually, you know what? Let's try the upscaling first. So we could go native AA. So this will run at native resolution, but using the FSR anti-aliasing at full resolution. It looks like that actually does drop our performance a bit. It looks like I'm down around 22-ish now. Looking out over here, we're actually, a little bit lower. So that does take a performance hit. From there, you could try frame generation. Let's see if it actually does anything for our frame rate. Remember, this is technically unsupported. And the 10 series GPUs don't have great asynchronous compute, which is how this is computed. However, that did boost us to 37. Now, our PC latency did not really improve. And as I pan the camera, I guess it's probably smoother, but it's still very not smooth, given that, we're at a very low frame rate. So this is not at all an ideal situation for using frame generation. In fact, if my base frame rate was that low, I think in a game that supports NVIDIA Reflex, I'd probably get a better experience just kicking that on to cut down on latency so my mouse at least felt a little bit more responsive. And if we go back to native resolution without that, that's cutting my PC latency down pretty significantly. And while it's still large gaps between frames, camera panning is not smooth. I can tell you right now, my hand motion and the screen feel a lot more tied together. So it does certainly make the game feel a lot more responsive. Now, the reason why I'm bringing that up is it doesn't appear to be compatible to use reflex with frame generation. Because if I kick this on, again, I've got to at least go to native AA and kick on frame generation. It doesn't cut latency when I have the reflex on. So for example here, at least as it's reported here, I don't have a hardware measurement tool. We're near 200 milliseconds of latency, around 190 something. And if I go ahead and kick reflex off in the menu and apply the changes and back out here, we're still pretty dang close to the 190 to 200 millisecond PC latency range. Meaning, while the menu lets me turn it on with frame generation enabled, it doesn't appear to actually be doing anything when frame generation is enabled. And so that actually does make a difference to how responsive the game feels. Anyway, the point is this is honestly way too low of frame rates for frame generation to give a good experience, and frame generation is not a technology that's great for boosting extremely low frame rates. However, we could try getting a higher base frame rate by using FSR3 quality upscaling. If I do that, we can see that our performance now is around 37 frames per second, 38 staring this way, around 30-ish going that way. I have reflex enabled, so it feels fairly responsive. But it's still, a very choppy camera pan. But like, I know a lot of us PC elitists with amazing hardware want to pretend like playing a game at 30 frames per second is impossible, but that's just not true. You absolutely could play the game like this, and the FSR3 upscaler does look a bit pixelated, especially in motion as I scroll side by side, and I don't think we've had major improvements since the FSR2 upscaler. However, this is where, again, with a higher base frame rate, still not very good. Let's see if it's able to compute both FSR quality and the frame generation and get any kind of boost out of that. Latency gets worse, but I think a lot of that is just that it's not compatible with reflex. However, staring this way, we are around 60 frames per second now. And as I pan the camera, again, it's unclear how well this will pick up in a YouTube video because the camera shutter and your YouTube screen are not in sync with the frames being presented on the screen. And we clearly drop down into the 40s as we pan this way. But overall, frame rates are higher, and I think we have a smoother camera pan. Although, again, the loss of reflex and the low base frame rate does make this feel a little bit floaty. I don't think this is a great experience from a latency perspective, although many people would probably find it playable and might be okay with this. Personally, I'm not. Now, I did just kick on a controller, and I've got to say that on a controller, I think this feels a lot better. So I'm more able to deal with a little bit of latency on my camera push. Right? Like I hit the camera push and then you see it move. You see what I'm saying? There's a tiny bit of delay there. Just not like a crazy amount, but it feels a lot worse on a mouse movement because a mouse feels like a one-to-one motion, and the joysticks, I guess I'm a little bit more okay with some latency on that. But I would say that I still do not feel like this is working well from a base frame rate. But here's the good news. It is actually generating frames. Right? The actual frame rate is higher, so the technology does seem to be working. It just doesn't feel good on this low of a base frame rate. And if we had a game that was just less demanding to run than this one, again, we're already at the low settings, then I think this might actually work pretty well. But again, we don't have a lot of games to choose from at the moment. Now, we could go to a more aggressive upscale, so I'm going down to FSR3 balanced. So this is lowering the internal rendering resolution, and with frame generation off, I get reflex again, and that helps it feel more responsive. Now, I've heard some people say you can force reflex through Special K with FSR3 active. I don't know if that's true. I have not tested that myself, but it's homework for you. Maybe you could play around with that. Okay, this feels more responsive. Again, I think it's more immediate when I press the button and when I get motion on screen. But like I said, we have a slightly higher base frame rate now. We could try frame generation. See how that goes. Okay, so it's boosting us into the 70s here. Scrolling this way, we're not quite locking to 60. A higher base frame rate is now making my mouse motions not feel as bad. So again, the base frame rate is making this feel more playable, and we do get increased smoothness as we pan the camera due to the generated frames, which it does seem to be generating at least some amount of frames. If we go down to a base performance resolution, again, if I could first try frame generation off, it looks like our base frame rate now staring this way, not moving, is 60, but as we pan the camera, it can go a lot lower, down into 40-ish range. But we have a higher base frame rate to work with now. This feels pretty responsive. The upscaling is starting to look extremely pixelated, especially as things get disoccluded. So like when this fence passes over that stuff in the background, especially like the trees back there, it takes them a second to kind of reconstruct what's going on behind them, and it's pretty pixelated in motion as you kind of scroll side by side. But again, we're asking a lot from this upscaler, and it is boosting the base frame rate, and the game does feel fairly playable. If I go ahead and kick frame generation on with that base frame rate, let's see what happens here. So we are boosting beyond what we were without it, so it is working in the sense that it is generating frames. And actually panning this way, we are staying around 60. Now, this is a 120 hertz screen. What I'm actually curious about doing next, what if somebody has a 60 hertz display? I wonder if we could try to achieve a locked 60 with VSync at these settings just for fun and see how that feels. I'll go back to display settings and do that. I'll be right back. Okay, it actually does look like we have achieved an almost locked. We do dip a little bit at times in motion, depending on what's going on the screen, but fairly close to a locked 60 frames per second. Again, using all of the FSR3. We're on performance upscaling, things are looking pixelated. We've got frame generation on, which means I don't have access to reflex, and that means that we are... I definitely feel a little bit of a disconnect between when I push the button and when something happens. So there's definitely a bit of a disconnect there. However, if I do a slow pan, things are shimmery from the reconstruction, but like the image is looking smooth because we are at a nice 60 frames per second on that nice camera pan. And the frame pacing actually feels fairly smooth. We did see it drop to 59 where I did feel like I had a little bit of a judder. Now the screen capture that you're seeing might not be as synced to what I'm seeing here, but that camera pan did look very smooth. I'm gonna go ahead and turn frame generation off at this 60 FPS numbers, although we're not 60 FPS anymore. And if I try that same camera pan, this is a lot more juddery. Now, I will also say that I currently have G-Sync disabled, so we're on a normal 60 hertz display as if you didn't have G-Sync or anything like that. So that's looking a lot more juddery. However, responsiveness-wise, again, reflex enabled now, it does feel a lot more responsive. So I will say that it feels better to play with the generated frames off. In this case, it really does feel like there's a much better connection between my mouse motion and what's happening on the screen. But I do think it looks better to have frame generation on, in the sense that camera pans do actually look a lot smoother. Although, again, it is taking a hit to losing reflex. So there's the generated frame latency, but there's also just the I don't get to use reflex latency, which does seem to matter here pretty significantly. Anyway, I think the main good news is it does seem to actually be generating frames, because the camera pans legitimately do smooth out with it enabled. So that is working. I'd like us to see if a 1070 has a better job here, but once again, I want to point out that if FSR3 ends up in more games, and maybe at games that run at a higher base frame rate, I think this card might do better. And like I said, it is generating frames. It's just not feeling particularly responsive coming from this low of a base frame rate. It feels a lot better coming from a higher one, and again, with reflex enabled, that helps out. Let's try out the 1070. All right, we're now on the 1070, and we're achieving 33 frames per second staring this way, and little bit over, I was going to say, we do dip under 30 at times facing this way, and especially in motion, we can definitely dip into the 20s. Currently, we are at the low everything, just like we were on the 1060. We're at 1080p, and right now VSync is off. Let's see, reflex is off, FSR3 is off, all of that. So this is native 1080p, none of that stuff going on. Latency's reporting around 130-ish, and turning the camera, again, feels a little sluggish, but you can play games around 30 frames per second, and at least we are achieving that at a native 1080p here on the 1070. But let's go ahead and see what happens if we try out some things. Once again, reflex is available if I'm not using frame generation, and that does cut latency significantly, and this part's a little harder for you to see, but I can tell you that my mouse movements now feel a lot more connected to my game. So while things still look very choppy, I am getting, I am feeling like, you could play the game around 30. It's certainly a thing you could do. Now, if we go FSR3, upscaling, we could now go to the quality setting, although we could try frame generation from the base of around 30. So if I go native AA actually first, so native AA, which can still keep, again, the upscaling can still keep reflex on. Our base frame rates do dip into the 20s on camera motion, which isn't great. And then I don't want to restart the chapter, no thank you. What I would like to do is kick on frame generation. Again, frame generation is now going to lose my access to reflex, despite what the menu says. And now, we are generating frames, but it's still not super high. I feel less connected to the mouse, but it did actually increase frame rate, 55-ish standing still, camera panning back and forth. We do get dips into the upper 30s, but mostly seems to stay into the 40s. And then if we go ahead and kick frame gen back off, we can compare that, okay, standing still here, we're only a little bit over 30. Camera panning this way, we dip into the 20s. So it is certainly adding in frames, smoothing out the video, and all that. And I realize I should have had, AMD specifically recommends VSync on when you are using frame generation. So when you're using frame generation, they actually do specifically recommend VSync on, and they also recommend a, they recommend frame rate limiting at half your monitor's max refresh rate, combined with VSync on in the game. There's some documentation about other such things. But anyway, so VSync on, frame generation on, we're certainly getting more frames, but let's go ahead and try to get a higher base frame rate. So again, graphic settings are already as low as we can get. So let's go ahead and kick on quality upscaling, kick frame generation back off. Frame gen off, quality upscaling standing still. Our base frame rate does get to 55. However, looking this way, it's significantly lower, around 41, and camera panning can drop into the 30s. Feels responsive enough to play, again, with reflex helping out with that. And then we can try kicking on frame generation from this base. Again, now I'm going to lose access to reflex, so PC latency is going to go up, and there'll be a little bit of generated frame latency. However, we are hitting 83 just standing still here, so it's definitely generating frames. And I will say that the camera panning motion absolutely looks smoother to me in person. So it's working, and we do dip to around 60 or so. We can dip a little bit below that at times. And I will say that despite the fact that I think, we're losing access to reflex, the PC latency right now is a lot better than what we were getting on on the 1060 just because we have the higher base frame rate to achieve 60 FPS this way. And this feels a lot less bad to me than what we were getting when we were getting to around 60 from the 1060. I think we have the higher base frame rate or something. Anyway, we could go down to a more aggressive upscale. If we go all the way down to performance mode, and again, kick frame generation off. So no frame generation, just upscaling, standing still. We're at a base of around 70. Looking this way does dip into the upper 40s and hover then around 52 once we're standing still. In motion, it looks like we can dip into the 40s. Again, things are looking a lot more pixelated, but our base frame rate's pretty good. The game feels pretty responsive, especially again because Reflex is now actually working. And then now we can kick on frame generation from this base. So from this base, okay, we actually are generating frames up to 97 while standing still. Looking this way, it looks like it'll be at 80 standing still. In motion, we dip into the 70s. Hey, maybe you got a 75 hertz monitor you're trying to VSync to. Or you could set your monitor to that. We're currently not locked to that, but I've got to say, actually, this feels responsive enough. It does feel less responsive than when I had frame gen off plus reflex on. But you know, not every game is going to offer reflex, so that is another thing we could look at. This particular game has reflex available if I have FSR3 frame generation turned off, but not every game is going to have that. So I could just turn reflex off to get a better comparison for if this was a different game, right? So reflex off, I'm getting a feel for the responsiveness of the camera, and then I'm going to generate the frames. It feels slightly more floaty. Slightly more floaty. Not terrible, though. I think a lot of people would actually be fine with this. And if this did help you reach your monitor's refresh rate, cool stuff. And one of the main things is that this is actually working. We are able to generate frames, increase the frame rate, and we can tell that it is actually smoothing out camera motion, since on a smooth camera pan, I do get less gaps in the frames than if we had frame generation turned off. So frame generation turned off here. Less gaps in the frames with it on. So it does seem to be actually working, which is cool. My kids I hear them coming in the door right now, getting home from school. I was filming this video between getting home from work and them getting home from school. So hopefully this was interesting. It does seem to be working on 10 series cards. I don't have a 1080 or a 1080 Ti or time to test them right now if I did. But hopefully you guys found this video useful and or interesting. The main conclusion seems to be that you can turn on frame generation. If you get a high enough, it does seem to generate frames, and if you can get a high enough base frame rate, you should give it a whirl, and, you know, maybe it will be something that you would like to use. And I hope all of you have an excellent day.